My sister used me as her babysitter for years, and when I finally set boundaries she freaked out and stopped talking to me. Here's the situation: I, 29F, have an older sister, Megan, 32F, and we've always been pretty close growing up. But things got a little complicated once she started having kids. Megan has 2 kids, a boy, 8M, and a girl, 5F, and while I love them dearly, lately, I feel like Megan has been taking advantage of me. Honestly, I'm reaching my breaking point. Some background: Megan's husband, Dave, 34M, works long hours as an ER nurse, and Megan is a stay-at-home mom. I live about 20 minutes away, and since I'm single with no kids, I guess Megan assumes I have more free time than she does. For the past 2 years, I've been helping her out by babysitting almost every weekend. It started off small, just a few hours here and there so she could run errands or have a date night with Dave. But recently, it's turned into all-day babysitting sessions, sometimes even overnight, and usually with little to no warning. Last weekend, things finally hit a breaking point. Megan called me at 8 in the morning, sounding frantic, and explained that she and Dave had a last-minute opportunity to go on a couple's retreat because someone had canceled. She asked if I could watch the kids for the weekend. Even though I had plans to hang out with some friends I hadn't seen in ages, I hesitated but eventually agreed because she sounded desperate. I canceled my plans, thinking I could use the weekend to relax with the kids at my place. But that was far from reality. The kids were restless, and Megan hadn't left me any clear instructions, so I spent most of the time scrambling to figure out their schedules. They both had activities planned, so I found myself driving them to soccer practice and ballet lessons, feeling more like a chauffeur than a loving aunt. What pushed me over the edge, though, was a call I received from Megan on Sunday afternoon. She mentioned, very casually, that she and Dave were having such a good time that they had decided to extend the trip by another day. She asked if I could keep the kids until Monday night. At that point, I had already been with the kids for over 48 hours with no clear end in sight. I was exhausted and frustrated, and I felt completely unappreciated. I told her I couldn't do it. I had work on Monday and wasn't about to call out because she wanted another day of vacation. Megan got defensive, saying I didn't understand how hard it was to be a mom and that, since I don't have kids, I just didn't get it. That comment stung, because while I may not have children, it didn't mean my time and life weren't valuable. The conversation turned into an argument. I expressed that while I love her kids, I wasn't her personal nanny, and I felt she was crossing boundaries. Megan hung up on me, but not before telling me that I was selfish and acting like a child. I ended up dropping the kids off at her house early Monday morning, since Dave had returned from his shift, and went home feeling awful. Since then, she's barely spoken to me. Megan sent me a passive-aggressive text later in the week, implying she wouldn't bother me for babysitting anymore and that she was disappointed in how unreliable I'd been. It's been almost a week now, and I haven't heard from her since. I'm feeling conflicted. I genuinely love my niece and nephew, and I want to help Megan out, but I feel like there need to be some boundaries. Am I overreacting? Should I have sucked it up and babysat for one more day to keep the peace? I'm not sure if I'm being unreasonable, or if Megan is truly taking advantage of me. After Megan's text, I thought the situation might calm down, but that didn't happen. A few days later, my mom called me, and it was clear Megan had already talked to her. My mom typically tries to stay neutral in family conflicts, but she's also very focused on keeping the peace between me and Megan. So, she tried to smooth things over by telling me that Megan was stressed and needed help. She mentioned how good I was with the kids and said that Megan was just going through a rough time and needed a bit more support. I understood that Megan had a lot going on and that being a stay-at-home mom, especially with Dave working long shifts, wasn't easy. But it wasn't like I was living a stress-free life either. I work a full-time job in marketing, and I need my weekends to recharge. When I explained this to my mom, she sighed and pointed out that I had more flexibility than Megan did. That comment irritated me because it felt like my life and my time were being devalued just because I didn't have kids. It seemed like my entire family assumed that because I didn't have children, I must have an abundance of free time. That's simply not true. I still had work obligations, social commitments, and, frankly, the need for some downtime. I love my sister, but I felt like she was expecting me to always drop everything for her. A couple of days after my mom's call, I ran into one of Megan's friends, Jessica, at the grocery store. Jessica and I weren't particularly close, but we knew each other well enough to chat briefly. She asked how I was doing, and I mentioned the recent babysitting situation. Jessica gave me a knowing look and told me that Megan had been venting about me recently. Apparently, Megan had told her friends that I was bailing on her and refusing to help out in her time of need. That news really bothered me because I had bent over backward to help her over the past couple of years. Now, she was painting me as the unreliable one in front of our mutual friends. At that moment, I realized the issue went deeper than just that weekend. Megan seemed to feel entitled to my time, and whenever I tried to push back, she made me feel guilty. The more I thought about it, the more upset I became, replaying all the times I had canceled plans or rearranged my life to accommodate her last-minute requests. What hurt the most was that I never asked for anything in return. I wasn't looking for payment or grand gestures, but a simple acknowledgement of the sacrifices I was making would have been nice. Instead, the more I helped her, the more she seemed to expect from me. And when I finally said no, it felt like I had become the villain in her narrative. I considered texting her to clear the air, but every time I picked up my phone, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Deep down, I felt like I needed an apology from her, some acknowledgement that what she had asked of me was unreasonable. But knowing Megan, I wasn't sure I would ever get that. As the week went on, the tension remained. Megan hadn't reached out to me, and our usual family Sunday dinner was coming up. I was dreading it, knowing that things were likely to be awkward after everything that had happened. A part of me even considered skipping it just to avoid the confrontation, but then I thought, why should I be the one to stay away? I hadn't done anything wrong, and if Megan had a problem with me, maybe it was time we hashed it out in person. Sunday dinner at my parents' house has always been a family tradition. It's usually relaxed and casual, with just us, my parents, Megan, Dave, and the kids, and sometimes a few cousins. But this time, the atmosphere felt tense as soon as I walked through the door. Megan was already there with the kids, and she was avoiding eye contact. Dave greeted me, but his usual friendliness wasn't there, it felt half-hearted. My mom immediately jumped in, talking a bit too loudly about how great the roast smelled and how everyone should sit down, clearly trying to smooth things over. The tension in the room was palpable, almost suffocating. Throughout dinner, Megan barely spoke to me. She focused on talking to my dad or taking care of the kids, and when I tried to engage her in small talk, she gave short, clipped answers. It was awkward, and I felt like everyone else could sense it too. After dinner, my mom asked me to help her clear the dishes in the kitchen. Once we were alone, she gently brought up the situation, whispering so Megan wouldn't overhear. She mentioned that Megan was still upset about what had happened the previous weekend and suggested that I should try to talk to her. I was still feeling frustrated, so I told my mom that Megan hadn't made any effort to speak to me. Instead, she had acted like I was the one in the wrong, and I didn't understand why she couldn't see my side of things. My mom, in her usual peacemaker way, tried to explain that Megan was feeling overwhelmed and probably didn't know how to ask for help without sounding demanding. I knew my mom meant well, but the whole conversation made me feel like I was the one who had to fix everything. In the end, I decided that if anything was going to change, I had to address it directly. I didn't want this awkward tension hanging over us any longer, and avoiding it wouldn't help. After dinner, I pulled Megan aside and suggested we talk privately. She seemed hesitant but agreed, and we stepped out onto the back porch. I didn't want to come off as confrontational, so I tried to start the conversation calmly. I told her that I didn't want there to be any weirdness between us and that I loved her and the kids, but we needed to talk about what happened last weekend. Megan crossed her arms and avoided looking at me directly. She explained that she didn't understand why I couldn't help out for one more day, especially knowing how difficult things were with Dave's schedule. She felt like I had let her down when she needed a break. I explained that while I knew she needed a break, I had already canceled my own plans and spent the whole weekend juggling the kids' activities. I told her it wasn't fair to ask for another day without checking if I could manage it. I reminded her that I had my own life and responsibilities, and that it wasn't just about having free time. Megan seemed hurt and told me that she had thought I would understand because I didn't have kids of my own. She had assumed I could handle it, like I always did. Hearing her say that made me realize she hadn't intended to be manipulative, she just didn't see things from my perspective. I tried to explain that I didn't view her or the kids as a burden, but that I needed her to recognize my limits. I told her that I wanted to help, but there had to be some balance so I didn't end up feeling resentful. Megan was quiet for a while, and I thought maybe she wouldn't respond at all, but then she admitted that she hadn't realized how much she was asking of me. She said things had been really hard for her, and she didn't know who else to turn to. She had assumed I could take it because I always did. It was a vulnerable moment, and I could see that she wasn't trying to be demanding, she was just overwhelmed. She apologized for assuming I'd be fine without checking in with me first and acknowledged that she should have asked instead of expecting. That was all I really needed to hear, an acknowledgement that what she asked was too much. We sat there in silence for a few minutes after that, just taking in the cool evening air. Eventually, Megan said she would do better about giving me more notice and not expecting me to drop everything at the last minute. I laughed a little and told her I would definitely appreciate that. When we went back inside, things were still a little awkward, but I felt like the worst of it was behind us. I left my parents' house feeling lighter, knowing that while everything wasn't completely resolved, Megan and I had at least cleared the air. In the days after our conversation at my parents' house, things between Megan and me started to shift. It wasn't a complete 180, but I could tell she was making more of an effort to respect my time. A week or so later, Megan called, but this time there was no urgency in her voice. She casually asked how I was doing, which was a welcome change from the usual immediate requests for help. As we talked, she admitted that she had been thinking a lot about our conversation and realized she had been putting too much pressure on me. Megan explained that she hadn't been fully aware of how much I was giving up to help her out. She mentioned she was looking into other ways to get support, like hiring a part-time sitter or asking Dave's parents to step in more often. There was a genuine tone in her voice that I hadn't heard in a while. She wasn't just saying what I wanted to hear, but actually trying to take responsibility for her actions. I felt a sense of relief when I heard her say all this. I reassured her that I still wanted to be part of her and the kids' lives, but I needed her to understand that my time was valuable too. Megan agreed and promised to be more mindful of not assuming I could always step in at the last minute. For the next few weeks, Megan stuck to her word. She began giving me a heads up when she needed help, asking a few days in advance rather than the day of. One time, she texted me asking if I could watch the kids for an afternoon. What surprised me was that she mentioned she had already tried to arrange other options, but since those fell through, she was checking with me before making alternative plans. That simple courtesy made a huge difference. That weekend, I spent the afternoon with the kids, and for once, it didn't feel overwhelming. Megan had left a detailed schedule, snacks, and even a contact list for emergencies. Everything felt organized and manageable, unlike the chaos I'd experienced before. When Megan came to pick them up, she thanked me and seemed genuinely appreciative of the help. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel taken for granted. Despite this progress, there were still some bumps along the way. About a month after our talk, Megan texted me on a Friday morning, asking if I could take the kids that night so she and Dave could have a last-minute date. I felt my heart sink a little, sensing old habits creeping back. It was the exact kind of spontaneous request we had just addressed. But instead of agreeing right away, I paused and reminded myself that I had already made plans with friends. I texted Megan back, letting her know that I couldn't help this time because I had other commitments. I was half expecting some pushback, but to my surprise, she responded quickly, saying she understood and would figure something else out. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that simple exchange left me feeling hopeful. Maybe Megan was really starting to understand the importance of not overloading me. However, about 2 weeks later, I noticed the same pattern re-emerging. Megan called, this time more frantic than before, saying that she needed someone to take the kids for an entire weekend because she and Dave had planned a spontaneous trip. She didn't ask if I was available, it felt more like an assumption that I'd step in. The tone in her voice sounded familiar, almost like we were right back where we had started. I felt a wave of frustration but stayed calm. I told her that I couldn't commit to the entire weekend on such short notice and reminded her that we had talked about these kinds of situations. Megan went quiet for a moment before apologizing, sounding embarrassed. She explained that she was overwhelmed and didn't know who else to call. It was clear she was still struggling to find balance, even with her newfound awareness of my boundaries. This time, instead of letting the frustration build, I suggested she try looking into hiring a sitter like she had mentioned before or perhaps planning her trips a bit further in advance. Megan agreed, but I could tell the conversation had left her feeling guilty, and it left me feeling conflicted. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to fall back into the same cycle. Later that night, I couldn't help but wonder if this back and forth was something that would always happen between us. Old habits are hard to break, especially when it comes to family. I loved Megan and her kids, but I realized that maintaining boundaries was going to be a constant work in progress. Megan wasn't going to change overnight, and I wasn't going to magically feel okay saying yes all the time. It was going to take patience, on both our parts. At the same time, I couldn't shake the guilt that crept in after every no. Even when I knew it was the right thing to do for my own sanity, there was always a small part of me that wondered if I was being selfish. Megan had her challenges, and I didn't want to seem like I wasn't there for her. But where did I draw the line between being helpful and being used? I wasn't sure what the answer was, and maybe that's why I decided to keep giving her more chances. But I also knew that if things didn't change for good, I'd have to make some harder decisions about how much I could really handle. For now, though, I was cautiously optimistic, hoping that with time, we'd find a way to balance being family without it turning into a one-sided arrangement. After the conversation where I suggested Megan look into hiring a sitter, things seemed to settle down for a while. There were fewer frantic calls, and Megan kept to her word about giving me more notice. I appreciated the space and began feeling like we had turned a corner. But, as I suspected, the pattern didn't completely disappear. About a month later, Megan called me again, and I could tell from her voice that she was feeling frazzled. She explained that Dave had picked up an extra shift unexpectedly, and she had double-booked herself with a commitment she couldn't get out of. She asked if I could take the kids for the afternoon. Unlike before, she added that she understood if I couldn't, which was a nice change in her approach, and she sounded genuinely apologetic for the short notice. I hesitated, though. That particular weekend, I had been planning to get some much-needed rest after a busy work week. But hearing the stress in Megan's voice, I felt torn. I agreed to take the kids, but I made it clear that I could only help for the afternoon, not the whole day. Megan thanked me and sounded relieved, but I could sense she was still struggling to juggle everything on her plate. When I picked the kids up that afternoon, they were their usual energetic selves, and we spent the time playing games and watching a movie. While the time with them was fun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was once again being pulled into a situation where I was expected to be the backup plan whenever Megan hit a snag. Later that week, I received another call from Megan, but this time, the conversation was different. She seemed more reflective and told me that she had been feeling guilty about asking for help so often. She explained that she had realized she was relying on me too much and that it wasn't fair. She mentioned that she had finally hired a sitter and was making an effort to manage her schedule better. Hearing this, I felt a mix of relief and surprise. Megan seemed to be taking concrete steps to lighten her own load, and for the first time, it felt like she was really trying to fix the situation, not just react to it. She went on to say that she appreciated everything I had done for her and acknowledged that she hadn't been the most considerate in how she asked for help. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from her, and I could tell she was being sincere. Megan admitted that part of her hesitation in hiring a sitter had come from feeling like she should be able to handle everything herself, or at least with family. She confessed that asking someone outside the family for help had made her feel like she was failing in some way. I told her that it was okay to need extra support and that hiring someone didn't mean she was doing anything wrong. In fact, I reminded her, it was probably better for everyone involved if she had reliable help she could count on. As Megan spoke, I realized that this wasn't just about her asking for too much from me, it was about her trying to do too much in general. I understood why she had leaned on me so heavily, but it didn't change the fact that I had to keep my boundaries firm. Megan promised that she would make sure not to overburden me in the future, but I couldn't help wondering how long this new phase would last. Still, I appreciated her honesty, and it felt like a real step forward. I told her that I was happy to help from time to time, but I needed to be asked, not expected. Megan seemed to take that to heart and told me she would be more mindful going forward. A couple of weeks passed, and I noticed Megan reaching out less frequently. She seemed to be getting more comfortable with her new sitter, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I had some breathing room. I could make my own plans without the nagging feeling that I'd have to cancel at the last minute to step in for her. One evening, Megan sent me a text, asking if I wanted to grab coffee and catch up. I agreed, and when we met up, it felt like old times. We talked about everything but the babysitting drama, and it was nice to just be sisters again, without the added tension. Megan seemed more relaxed too, and I could tell that the extra help she had found was making a difference. However, as much as things were improving, I still couldn't shake the underlying worry that we might fall back into the same cycle. Old habits die hard, and I knew Megan well enough to recognize that she would always try to juggle more than she could handle. It was just her nature. But at least now, it felt like we were both more aware of the boundaries that needed to be in place. Despite the positive changes, part of me was still cautious. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. There would likely be more moments where Megan slipped up or leaned on me too much, but I was ready to keep reminding her, and myself, that it was okay to say no. For now, though, I was hopeful. Megan was trying, and that was all I could really ask for. Things with Megan stayed pretty calm for a while after our coffee meet-up. She seemed to be sticking to the boundaries we had set, and I was starting to feel like we had found a better balance. The new sitter was working out well, and Megan didn't seem to be relying on me as much, which gave me the space I needed to focus on my own life. But as I suspected, it wasn't long before that balance was tested. It was a Saturday morning, and I had just started making plans with a friend for brunch when Megan called. She sounded panicked, which immediately set off alarms in my head. She explained that her sitter had called in sick at the last minute and that Dave had been called into work for an emergency shift. She asked if I could take the kids for the day, just until the evening, as she had an important event she couldn't miss. I could feel the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. Megan had been doing so well at respecting my time, and I had enjoyed the break from the constant babysitting. But this sounded like a real emergency, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. A big part of me wanted to say yes, I didn't want to leave her in the lurch. But I had made plans, and I also didn't want to fall back into the habit of always being the default solution whenever something went wrong. I told Megan that I already had brunch plans but would see if I could adjust my schedule to help her out later in the day. She was clearly disappointed but thanked me and said she understood. Still, I could hear the tension in her voice, like she was trying not to pressure me but also didn't have many options left. After hanging up, I felt conflicted. I didn't want to let her down, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that this was the exact type of situation we had talked about avoiding. It was always going to be hard to maintain those boundaries when it felt like an emergency on her end. I wrestled with the decision for a while, but in the end, I called her back and told her I could come over in the afternoon after brunch, but I wouldn't be able to stay the whole day. She sounded grateful but still a little stressed, and I could tell she had been hoping I'd say yes to the entire day. I went to brunch, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. The guilt nagged at me the entire time, wondering if I was being selfish or if this was a necessary reminder for Megan to continue looking for other options when things didn't go as planned. Part of me felt like I should have just canceled my plans and helped her out, but another part of me was proud that I didn't automatically cave in, even though I knew how much she was struggling. When I got to Megan's house that afternoon, the kids were their usual lively selves, and Megan was rushing around trying to get ready for her event. She thanked me hurriedly and gave me the rundown of what they needed before rushing out the door. There wasn't much time for conversation, and I could sense that she was still stressed about everything going wrong that day. The few hours I spent with the kids went smoothly, but the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to become a regular pattern again if I wasn't careful. I enjoyed being there for my niece and nephew, but I was also very aware that Megan was likely relying on me as her fallback option when things fell apart. I didn't want to be stuck in that role again. When Megan returned that evening, she looked relieved but exhausted. She thanked me again, saying she didn't know what she would have done if I hadn't come. I told her I was glad I could help, but I gently reminded her that it wasn't always possible for me to drop everything, even in an emergency. I mentioned that it might be a good idea to have a backup sitter lined up in case her regular one wasn't available. Megan nodded, clearly understanding what I was getting at, but I could see the guilt in her expression. She said she would try to be better about planning for these kinds of situations, and I believed her, but I couldn't help feeling that we were always going to come back to this same issue. Megan's life was chaotic, and no matter how much she tried to plan, things would always come up that pushed her limits, and, by extension, mine. That night, as I drove home, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since we first had that confrontation. Megan had grown more aware of my boundaries, and I had gotten better at saying no when I needed to. But I realized that this was always going to be a work in progress, especially with someone like Megan, who was constantly juggling more than she could handle. I knew I would have to keep setting boundaries and reminding her, over and over, that I couldn't always be the backup plan. The question was, how much longer would I be able to keep this up before I reached my breaking point again? After that Saturday, things between Megan and me fell into a routine again, but this time with a little more balance. I noticed that she started leaning less on me for last-minute favors, which was a huge relief. She still asked for help occasionally, but there was a clear effort to be respectful of my time, and when she did ask, she always seemed more aware of the impact it had on me. But, as expected, life didn't stop throwing curveballs at her. About a month after the last babysitting incident, Megan reached out again, but this time with a different tone. She told me up front that she had something important to talk about and that she wanted to grab coffee to discuss it. I felt a bit of unease, unsure of what was coming, but agreed to meet her the next day. When we sat down, Megan looked more exhausted than usual, but not in the frantic way I had seen before. She seemed more reflective, almost like she had been thinking about this conversation for a while. She started by acknowledging how much she had been relying on me over the past few years and said she understood that things had gotten out of hand. She admitted that, despite her best intentions, she had slipped back into old habits, and she was afraid that she was damaging our relationship because of it. What took me by surprise, though, was what she said next. Megan revealed that she and Dave had been talking, and they were considering some bigger changes to help ease the pressure. Dave had been offered a more stable position with fewer erratic shifts, and Megan had started looking into part-time work now that the kids were getting older. She explained that she wanted more balance in her life, not just for herself, but also for her family. She confessed that she had been overwhelmed for too long, and relying on me had been a crutch she wasn't proud of. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in a long time. Megan admitted that she had never intended to take advantage of me, but she had realized that her constant calls for help were a symptom of something bigger, her inability to manage everything she had taken on. She said that while she appreciated my help, she couldn't keep leaning on me the way she had been. It wasn't healthy for her, for me, or for the kids. I sat there, processing everything she was saying, and for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of relief that we were finally on the same page. Megan was starting to see that the solution wasn't just asking me for help whenever things got tough, it was about rethinking how she was handling her life. I told her that I appreciated her honesty and that I was glad we were having this conversation. I admitted that there had been times when I had felt overwhelmed and frustrated, but I also understood that she had been dealing with a lot. I reassured her that I loved being an aunt and spending time with her kids, but I needed to have my own life too. Megan nodded, saying she had come to realize that setting boundaries wasn't about shutting each other out, it was about making sure our relationship could thrive in a healthier way. As we wrapped up the conversation, Megan told me she was planning to set up more consistent childcare so that I wouldn't always be her first call. She also said she was working on being better at planning ahead, instead of leaving things to the last minute and scrambling for help. It wasn't just talk this time, I could tell she was serious about making changes. Over the next few months, I saw those changes happen. Megan's life didn't suddenly become perfect, but there was definitely less chaos. She started working part-time at a local business and seemed happier with the routine. Dave's new job allowed him to be home more, and Megan found other ways to balance her responsibilities without falling back on me as a crutch. I, too, learned something important through all of this. I had been so focused on making sure Megan respected my boundaries that I hadn't realized how much I needed to respect them myself. Saying no had been hard, but necessary, and ultimately it had helped both of us grow. By the time the next family dinner came around, things felt different. The tension that had once hovered between us was gone, replaced by a new understanding. Megan and I were closer now, but in a way that felt more sustainable. We weren't just sisters helping each other out of obligation, we were supporting each other in ways that respected both our needs. And while there were still moments when Megan asked for help, the frantic, last-minute calls had stopped. She had found other solutions, and when she did reach out to me, it was with appreciation, not expectation. As I sat at the dinner table, watching Megan laugh with her kids and seeing Dave actually able to join us without being rushed off to work, I realized how much we had both grown. It wasn't a perfect ending, life rarely offers those, but it felt right. We had learned to navigate our relationship with clearer boundaries and better communication, and I was proud of both of us for getting there. In the end, it wasn't just about babysitting or canceled plans. It was about finding a way to be there for each other without losing ourselves in the process. And for that, I was grateful.